Hi, this is a wonderful moment in 2014, to be exact, September 12th, 2014. And I am sitting in my office at the Eagleton Institute of Politics with my longtime friend and teacher and colleague and inspiration, F.S.Schmertz. And Ida has come to visit today because we are, some of us at the Center for American Women and Politics, you'll know why I glitched on that in a minute, are determined to put down on the record some of the memories, some of the early memories of the center being established. One of the, I think a number of us, one of the things that we're most proud of is the fact that the Center for American Women and Politics today exists as a very respected national research, resource, education center, and probably it was unique when it was founded in 1971 and remains unique today in the nation, and I think is of great service to the nation. So the staff today, great, active, industrious, expert staff, doesn't have a clue about what it was like when it was founded. There were one or two people who have a long memory, but even they are younger than we are, and don't know what those first days were like. So F.S.Schmertz and I met when the center was established. We were introduced to one another by the two women on the center's original executive committee who were asked to find staff for the center. And so I thought, while we were still able to speak and and exercise our memories, we would go back in history and put down some of those memories. The center was founded in July of 1971. Officially founded, announced, and actually through some press channels. But the idea for the center and the discussions about it and some of the preliminary work that was done, that is the creation of an advisory committee and an executive committee, this happened before Ida and I, had anything to do with it and knew about it. But it happened at a moment in history, and so just to start this by saying that in 1970 and 1971, something was happening in the world. It was a moment in the women's movement that had become active and come to public attention in the late 1960s. And the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University, that had a faculty of 100% men at the time, proposed to the Ford Foundation, as part of a larger proposal to fund its work about state politics and government, particularly state legislatures, also included in a proposal a request for what then seemed like an enormous amount of money, but in fact, when we look back, was a very small amount of money, $50,000 for 2 years, to establish a new unit at the Institute to study the participation of women, or the absence of women, in American politics and government. And some people who were associated with the faculty at the time brought into connection with the Institute a number of people who developed an advisory committee. The advisory committee, which was very large, about 50 people, was full of names, very impressive names, which was part of what made the center so unique, because I don't think there was any women's organization in the country at that time that had associated with it the kind of people who were on our advisory committee, people like Margaret Mead and Eleanor Holmes Norton and Suzanne Keller, the first woman ever tenured at Princeton University as sociologist, and a whole array of very impressive people who were willing to lend their names to the idea of a program to study women in politics. And then a small group of these advisory committee members were asked by the then director of the Eagleton Institute, the first Eagleton director, a man named Donald Hertzberg, to search out a staff. And that's the moment that Ida and I got involved. But enough of that for this moment, I would like us to get into some conversation about that time, what was happening in 1971, and how did we hear about the center, and how did we get involved, and why did we get involved? So in my case, I was already teaching courses about, I was an English professor, and I was teaching courses about women in literature, women poets, and that all came about as a result of a social movement. Academia had no courses, no programs before the women's movement reemerged in American life in the late 60s, but then began to develop an interest among young academics, and courses and books and articles emerged. I don't think there was anything about women in politics. There was something about women in literature at the time. You, at that time, were leading, for the most part, a private life, but you had a political background, and which I did not have. I had a reading novels and poems background, but you had a political background and had a history at a women's college, and I think that had something to do with how you first heard about it, right?
Yes, I just want to make a comment that Don Hertzberg, who was the director of the Eagleton Institute at the time, I think he was the founding director of the Eagleton Institute.
He was the first director.
The first
correct?
director. Took an enormous risk because it was he who proposed the concept, so far as I know, of a Center for the American Women in Politics. And he discussed it with the then Dean Marjorie Foster, which is how I got involved. But there was no such thing as any issue institute study on women and politics. It was just, as people said, there's no there. So the fact that the Ford Foundation funded this non-existent at the time institute was a tribute to Don Hertzberg and his willingness to put his name on the line for this, I think. And so far as I know, he was the only person on the Eagleton faculty at the time who was enthusiastic about this, despite the fact that, as you mentioned, it was the heyday of the women's movement. I mean, Betty Friedan had published a book, right?
In the 60s.
Feminine Mystique. I believe now the National Organization of Women had been established. But that was about it. Bella Abzug was talking about running for Congress, I think. But
the date that we were established, that the center was established, July 1971, I always used to say this when I made speeches, because the center, of course, it took many years before we became nationally known. But what was instantaneously nationally known was something else that happened exactly at the same time. In July of 1971, when in New Brunswick, New Jersey, the center was established. In Washington, D.C., the National Women's Political Caucus was founded and established, and Bella Abzug and Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan and the women who had been involved with the National Organization for Women in the early years of the second wave of American feminism were part of that founding group. And that was actually really important because it was the signal from the women's movement that somebody had to pay attention to the women on politics piece. And here on campus, it was the first moment that someone at any university, any college in the country, acknowledged that asking questions about women's participation in politics was important.
And I believe that was around the time the ERA passed Congress and was sent to the states for ratification, the Equal Rights Amendment. And something had convinced the national political parties, because the next convention it was required that 50% of the delegates were women. So there was a lot of ferment, but it was just happening at the time that we were established. I heard about it through Wellesley College, where I went to school, because Dean Foster was a graduate of Wellesley.
Dean Marjorie Summers Foster was the dean of Douglas College, which was the women's college at Rutgers University, and Eagleton is housed in a building on that campus.
My at the time, political involvement was after the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. I was involved with a person whom I met at the Democratic National Committee of starting a national organization for gun control.
Wow.
And I did that from 1968 to 1970, part-time, a very heavy part-time, because I had 2 young children in New York City and was commuting out here to Eagleton very shortly thereafter. But when you and I were met, I'm not sure we were already on the staff. I had a feeling we were still being interviewed. Maybe they wanted to interview us together.
Yeah, I don't actually know why they brought us in together, but my first interview, I heard about this because I lived in the area at the time,
Right.
had decided to take a year off from academia to try to write and hang out with my then very young daughter. But I didn't want to write academic. I wanted to write without having the talent and the creativity, but I wanted to write the way Joan Didion was writing in those days, and not so much refereed articles for academic publication. So I decided to take a year, and I was reading the local newspaper, and I read about the Eagleton Institute of Politics and the grant that included, and it was interesting because the article made it seem as if the grant to Eagleton, which I believe was over $300,000 at the time, was to establish the center. And so, the impression I got was there was an enormous entity was about to be established, but it turned out that it was a small part of that grant devoted to the center. But I read about it, and I was going to take a year off and play with Maud and write. And I had already taught a course on women poets in Pittsburgh and a course on women in the Victorian novel at another school in New Jersey. And so I was interested in these issues, and I thought, while I'm taking my year, I'll volunteer to help if they need some volunteers or interns or something like that. But my interest in politics, unlike yours, didn't come out of a political party or any kind of really local politics. It came much more out of a family background of escaping from the Holocaust and thinking that unless we had good government and good democracy and the world got to be a better place, none of us would make it through. So I cared about politics in a very large global sense, but I had absolutely no experience with anything local. Yeah. And when I met you, I began to learn from you, actually, about
I remember at the time you were talking about Gloria Steinem because you had either met her or heard her speak in the very early days, maybe in Pittsburgh. Is that possible?
Yeah.
And that inspired you.
That too. That too. Well, I went in the summer of 71, but this was, I think, after we met and after they made us the offer. I went to a program. I was accepted into a program sponsored. I think it was the first federally funded program invested in women's issues, sponsored by the Office of Education on women in higher education. It was a 4-week program, residence program at the University of Pittsburgh. And many speakers came in, some of whom became very famous later, but already Gloria Steinem was well known, and she was one of the speakers and came and spent some time with us, and I did find her inspiring, and I remember that visit very well. I also remember that it was the heyday in some ways of the women's movement, and the people in that group were the way I was. We weren't the people who were marching on the streets. We were the people who were teaching courses, thinking about becoming administrators in higher ed, professional women, and nonetheless were so caught up in all of this that, or so sensitive to these issues, and had begun to read Betty Friedan and Simone de Beauvoir and Sisterhood is Powerful and some of the early books that we all read, that on one memorable day in that program, when some of the male administrators at the university, I believe it was from the University of Pittsburgh, because that's where the session was held, came in to speak to us and said something that the women, there were about 30 of us, I think, found offensive, and asked him to leave. And he refused to leave. And spontaneously and with no plan or organization, several of the women got up and proceeded to the front of the room to physically escort him out of the room, at which point he used whatever tactics he'd learned and he went prone, stiff as a board, and these women wheelbarrow marched him out of the room. So that's just to say that it was such a moment in time, and it was the moment in which this center was created. So much was going on. Nothing had happened yet in the sense of progress for women in politics, but much was going on. And just one last point, it was in 1972, of course, when Shirley Chisholm ran for president. And yes, the Democratic Party, and yes, the 1972 convention and all the controversy around whether the women's movement, Gloria Steinem and Bella Abzug and the others, would support her, because they didn't, knowing that she didn't have a real chance to get the nomination, or would make a hard-nosed realpolitics choice and support the nominee and the party so that they could negotiate for the kind of thing you're talking about, an increase in women delegates and other policy issues within the Democratic Party. So there was a lot of ferment at the time.
You mentioned the $50,000 that we had for a 2-year budget at the time. I think that neither us, nor the members of our advisory committee, nor certainly anybody we approached for money during all those years of the early struggle would have guessed or bet that you and I would be sitting here today in 2014, and the center is thriving as never before. It's a huge tribute to you as director. It's a huge tribute to Debbie Walsh, the current director, but also to the vision and the programs we initiated 43 years ago. Simply amazing.
We have to get to talking about those programs and that vision, but I want you to reminisce a little bit more first about, so I don't think we were hired when we met. I don't remember why they brought us together, but I do remember the first time I met you, it was in this building, and it was Shirley Anderson and Lucia Ballantyne, the co-chairs of the executive committee, who became very important in the first phase of the center. And you came in from New York, and they invited me in, and you had heard about it, as you say, through Wellesley and whatever connection the then Dean of Douglas had with, I thought there was a very famous woman, famous in those circles, who was the head of the Wellesley kind of career placement office, and she would identify some of the powerful Wellesley women like you and send them out on these opportunities. Wasn't her name
Joan something or
Bishop?
other.
Was it
Joan Bishop, my goodness.
Isn't that
for you.
who it was?
Yes.
Yeah. And I don't know if she was still there when Hillary came to Wellesley a few years
that was
later.
10 years later. Yeah.
Not that much later. And
10 years.
Yeah. But the Wellesley women, if we could just do a whole hour on who was in your class and in that 10-year period between your class and Hillary's and the kinds of women, it was why I bothered my daughter for, her entire childhood and adolescence about how she had to go to Wellesley, because great women were going to Wellesley. And
well, I'd like to think that Joan Bishop advised Hillary Clinton on her future career, and Madeleine Albright, just to name two.
Right. And you introduced me to Madeleine Albright later when we went to her for advice about the center at one point, when she was, before she went into government. She was
at Columbia.
Yeah, she was at a university. I thought it was in Washington. But it doesn't matter. She was an academic at the time. In any case, so they identified you, and you began conversations with Shirley and Lucia about becoming involved in the staff. And they took this $50,000 for 2 years, so they had $25,000, right? And from that they had to figure out a way to hire. I think Don Hertzberg, to whom you give good credit, although I'd have a couple of other comments about my early experiences with him, but they figured a way to carve that small amount of money up to hire several of us. And I think you said, well, you were commuting from New York, so what was it, half-time or one-third
Yes.
time, I think?
Well, we
beginning.
figured half-time or part-time because it was important to me to at least have part of the summer or Christmas vacation, spring vacation with the 4 and 5-year-old children I had then. Since I was gone all week during the school year, they weren't even in school. And so that's the way we negotiated it. And you worked a regular schedule.
Well, halftime. No, I came on
You came halftime also?
Yeah,
We both
I
came
was
in
hired
halftime?
halftime at very beginning. It only lasted about a month or so with me, and then I became full-time. But halftime to develop education programs, and you
Right.
were asked to develop what they called government relations or something like that, the political piece of it. I knew the classroom side, you knew the
Actually, I
politics.
decided, I got in touch with them and said I really couldn't accept a job when they offered it because of the commute and other issues. But I'd be happy to volunteer. And it was they who offered me part-time. I was very smart. Of course, it was a budget reason, so it fell right into there.
Yeah, I don't think it was budget reasons. I think they wanted you. I think they wanted you. Tell me why you were interested in this.
I've always been interested in women and worked on women and women's related issues ever since I got out of college. And the jobs I had applied for, which were international, I was turned down because I was a woman, because I was single, because I was attractive, because I couldn't travel with my male colleagues in places like Africa. That would have been unseemly. So even though I got very far in all the interview processes, at the end I was always turned down because I was a woman.
Did they
I
say
would
that?
become married, I would become pregnant. They all assured me of this. So by that,
So they were explicit. This is why you weren't getting these jobs.
oh yeah, it was very straightforward. So no, I didn't make this up. So willy-nilly, I became a feminist before I knew the word. And it's hard to think back to those days. But what was I doing? A lot of things with women. And then I worked with the American Association of University Women. And I represented them on the Hill. And I started international programs for them and their branches around the country. The organization still exists, but in those days it had more clout. And I started the women studying China at a time when you were not allowed to talk about relations with China, before Kissinger went, and at a time when all the professors who had once been diplomats in China had to leave the universities where they taught, including Harvard. So that's one example of involvement in public policy that involved women. And I went around the country talking to all these women, among other things. And I was involved with the International League of Women Voters, Women Internationally. So, you know, just one thing led to another. So this seemed perfect, because subsequent to that I was involved with domestic politics and politics in New York. After college, I went to work at the Democratic National Committee, at Lee Stevenson's campaign, so it was sort of consistent
With your history.
evolution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the
I-
content was, and then the experience
Yes.
of being a woman. Right.
But the interesting about the center was the subject in academia of women and politics. It did not exist. It did not exist in political science. They were not studying women. It did not exist in any textbooks that I ever read or studied. You know more about academia than I do. But I thought that was a great challenge.
One of people around here who hear me talking to new groups of students, freshmen and others about, it could have been, when I came here or the beginning of the center, are very used to hearing me say that this is the first time I think I've ever said it where it would be recorded, and it's very chutzpah-like, but it was, we created the subject.
Yes.
It didn't exist as a subject for study. There was certainly no books about it. I could name something that had been published by a man named Martin Gruberg that had a long list of the names of women who served in various positions around the country. It was kind of an index, but there were no courses, there was no subject, and frankly, one of the early programs that we did, but this is a bit down the road, I don't want to do right now, but we did a head count to find out who's out there, how many women are actually holding elective office, appointive office, serving in party leadership positions. Nobody knew anything, and we did the first census when we got to that point. But the actual naming it as a subject, and another memory I have from early on that I've told many times also, is when we were here already and the Eagleton Institute was being reviewed, I believe, by a group of political scientists who came from other colleges to come around and walked into my office one day, a couple of men, I don't remember their names, but they were well-known political scientists from other universities, and they said, well, what are you doing at this center, and what work are you doing? And I said, well, and I explained some of it, and I said that we were identifying the women who were serving in office around the country, and nobody knew who they were or how many there were, what the picture was. And he said, one of them said to me, well, that's fine, but when you finish doing that, what else would there be to do or say? There is no, and a later part of the story, which I will get to with Jean Kirkpatrick and our conference and our book, and what some of the responses were to the idea of actually writing about women in politics. So it is true. It's kind of unbelievable at this moment. We could talk at this moment about what has to be accomplished, what still remains to be accomplished, and what the challenges are. But we also, in measuring the distance between that moment you're describing and I'm remembering, and now it's just incredible that it wasn't even a subject, much less that there were people out there, doing things.
Well-known political scientist here at Rutgers, who I felt so insulted, but really laughed at us. He's a much-loved man, and I don't doubt very much that he remembered it. But he laughed at what we were trying to do. He thought it was ridiculous. And even Alan Rosenthal, the revered former director of the Eagleton Institute and a world authority on United States state legislatures, had no interest in the Center for the American Women in Politics or in anything we were trying to do until we held the first conference of women state legislators. And then he began to be interested. And
at the 10th anniversary conference, he stood up in 1982 in front of those women who had stood up, one of whom had stood up and said, because the ERA had just gone down, the battle for it had just been lost, and she got up and introduced herself to the conference and said, when I die on my tombstone, I wanted to say I fought for the Equal Rights Amendment, the state legislator. And he got up at the conference and said he really didn't support the Equal Rights Amendment. And some of these women legislators came up to me and said, how can you, I'd say he's kidding. He's kidding. So it was, a very complicated mixed picture. And actually, to go back to the earlier years, two memories, and I don't want it to just be about us remembering negative things, but Don Hertzberg, the first director of Eagleton, I always remember coming into my office one day, very early on, carrying a copy of New York Magazine, and it was open to a page inside that had a cover of a new magazine that was just being published, and it was inserted into New York Magazine, and it was called Ms. Magazine, and he came up to show it to me, and his comments and attitude were something about how amusing this was and how it probably wouldn't have a long life. But nonetheless, he wanted to show it to me and found the whole thing very fascinating. And the other memory I want to put on, just because you've mentioned Marjorie Foster and you're being turned down for jobs, it was different in academia. I mean, I didn't have lots of jobs being offered, but we had a different set of experiences about women being appointed to jobs. Most of us who had PhDs at that moment had them in a couple of fields that seemed to be more receptive. So you'll run into women these days or over the years who've done many different kinds of things professionally, but they'll say, well, my PhD was in English, because so many of us went into literature, and at that time there were virtually no women getting PhDs in the sciences and math and engineering and economics, but some were in literature and history. They were very important early fields in developing women's studies and work about women. But when we first came to Rutgers, I came with my then husband, who had taken a faculty position here, and we were invited, and I was at the time still finishing my I'd finished my dissertation, but it was at an early moment. I was working on it, on some parts of it. And we were invited to dinner. He was invited as a new faculty member to dinner at Marjorie Summers Foster's home, the Dean of Douglas, who had a home on campus. It's still there for the Dean of Douglas. And so it was for new faculty. And we were sitting in the downstairs drawing room after dinner talking, and I was engaged in conversation with someone in the English department who was a professor of American literature, which was my field. So I was busy talking about the work I was doing at the time on Herman Melville. And the Dean of Douglas, a woman, came around and tapped me on the elbow and asked me if I was a spouse at that dinner, because I was there because I was married to someone who had been appointed to the faculty. She tapped me and she asked if I would come and join her and the other ladies upstairs.
Ah, yes.
And the men were left to smoke their cigars downstairs, and we repaired to the second floor where there was an apartment. She had an apartment as dean of the college, and it was the wives. Certainly they weren't faculty women. It was the wives and the dean of the college. And it was something like out of a Victorian novel. I could not believe it was happening, but it was. And yet, she, as you pointed out, was one of the supporters of the center being established, and was on our
Very
original
much so.
advisory committee, and was someone who spoke for us and stood for us. And yet, those conventions and traditions, even in a professional woman's life like that, were still very much a part of the world that we lived in.
Well, speaking of the advisory committee, there were 50 members on the advisory committee.
About that, yeah.
Many of whom are extremely distinguished, and recognizable names today. Others somewhat more anonymous because they were in academia or lawyers or something. But they did not agree at all on what the future Center for the American Woman in Politics should be about. Because I remember the first meeting that I attended
Was in the fall of '71.
They're all used to being heard. They're all used to expressing themselves. But most of them were very ignorant about politics. It was, lots of them spoke about women in other fields. I don't remember anybody speaking explicitly about women and politics. I strongly remember a statement by Margaret Mead, who was one of the more distinguished members of that group and very forceful, who said that the center and women in politics would have a great future because as women age, they become more and more energetic and active. Their children are grown and so on. And as the women's movement caught on, she foresaw that more and more would be interested in and engaged in politics. I thought she was one of our greatest advocates.
She was fascinating. She once came to my office. She was on the research subcommittee of the advisory committee, and she came to a meeting with her walking
staff,
stick,
yeah.
right, with her staff. She came upstairs here to the third floor. We were the girls in the attic here at Eagleton.
And her cloak.
And her cloak, and she came to the meeting, and what I remember her saying at that meeting, you're remembering a different one, is she foresaw that one of the most interesting developments that we should all be anticipating as more and more women went into the workforce and as men and women work together more in various professions is that marriages would be challenged. There would be office romance, and it would be a place men and women would meet one another, and it would change the dynamics of male-female relationships. I remember her.
Which was her great subject. But an advisory committee of 50 is totally unmanageable. One should never have an advisory committee of 50 unless they're all donors, which these people certainly were not. It was very distinguished, and maybe it gave the center a certain amount of cachet in some circles. But the fact of the matter is, it was you and I who developed the program, with support from other people, but we developed the initial program, and we pretty much determined and articulated what the center would be about and what the center would do, in my recollection.
Absolutely. The chief, for me, the advisory committee meeting, I remember one member being very upset because we were going to, it was really clear from the way we were talking about developing education programs and research and other conferences that our concept of American politics was the two-party system and reform. We were reform-minded and we were interested in reform and change, but within the basic general structures of the system. And I remember one member being upset about that and saying that she didn't understand how, either party could be responsive to us, and she had a much more left, we would call it a left agenda. But so there was a broad spectrum of everything from support and enthusiasm to the kind of insights that Margaret Mead brought to the politics of somebody like that. It was just people from the labor movement, people who were the head of major cultural institutions in New York, Eleanor Holmes Norton when she was a New York Human Rights Commissioner, just a fascinating array. But you're absolutely right, when it came to program, the education programs, I came back from that Pittsburgh summer and went up to a little office upstairs here and sat at a typewriter in those days and just made it up, started to make up what would an education program be. And we didn't have any books, so we were all using the same 5 books, whether we were sociologists, political scientists, English, whatever, and it was all Simone de Beauvoir and Sisterhood is Powerful and Betty Friedan, and in those days, there were about 5 books that everybody used, no matter what discipline they were in. But we did develop the ideas for the program. You developed the critical concept for the first conference programs and structured them in connection with Eagleton Institute's standing and experience with work in state legislatures and state politics. And I do want us to move to that, but before we do, I do want to say that yes, it was the 2 of us on program, but I remember our experience in the early years as 4 women working together.
Yes. Okay.
Women I'd never met before, these kinds of women. You were one, Lucia Ballantyne was one, and Shirley Anderson, the 2 co-chairs of the executive committee who hired us. And it was Lucia and Shirley who taught me. You don't get a PhD in English and know anything about writing a proposal or a budget or a grant application. And I remember walking into one meeting, the four of us, and I had this, I guess, education program idea, and said how much I thought it would cost. And I think it was Lucia who said, "Okay, dear, just double that." And that's how you. And I remember her. And this speaks to your point about how these people on the advisory committee came from, many of them very prestigious, and they were friends in their networks, in Lucia Shirley's, Don Hertzberg's, some other faculty members here, their networks. And how Lucia would write these one-line notes to the chairman of the board of U.S. Steel or some major corporation that no other women's organization or program in the country had any access to, and we didn't substantively, but she had family connections, and she would write something like, "Charlie, dear, I'm doing some work for this organization. Now, would you make a gift?" And so we'd get a small grant, a small gift from some of these corporations. It was way before there was a consciousness among them of what they had to do about the issue of women in leadership, women on their boards, women in executive positions. You went on to have an executive position.
And Lucia did a lot of fundraising, and they had a great advantage, which was hard for corporations to understand, the personal connections a CEO or somebody could get. But we were about politics, women and politics, but we were totally nonpartisan. We did not run women for office or contribute to political campaigns. We were an academic institution. And yes, we were doing research, but it was an activist kind of research that would be meaningful in the public sphere and for public policy. And to communicate that was a new animal, that combination of characteristics which defined the center. I think it was very hard.
And was not respected in academia because they saw us as advocates.
You know what occurs to me? Mm-hmm. Shirley Anderson, who did all kinds of wonderful things for us and was a great supporter, was very close, even in those days, to he who is now the richest or second richest man in the world.
I know.
And he contributed to all kinds of wonderful liberal causes, and we never got a dime. I don't even know if she tried.
It was one of her closest friends, Susie Buffett and Warren, yes.
I can't believe that we didn't get any money
Shirley
from him.
Smith Anderson.
At this point, I would go in an instant.
Absolutely.
But then, what did I know?
Yeah, neither did I.
That was interesting. But Shirley and Lucia and you and I worked very closely together in those early years, and they were over here a lot. We discussed everything with them.
We went through major life changes, all four of us. It was very professional and also personal. People were doing all sorts of things in dramatic moments in their lives, which I don't think this memory is about. So we won't go into all that. But it was. When I first came to talk to them the very first time, I was invited, and I didn't meet you then. It was at Lucia's house in Princeton, New Jersey, in the Woodrow Wilson house, which is where she was living. And I walked into this gigantic foyer with a huge pool table, and then they began to talk to me about this center, and I had no idea they were interviewing for director. I thought I was just there to talk about being a volunteer. And they began to talk, and then they said, well, would you be willing just to give us some of your ideas about how such a center should be developed? And I went home, and it was spring vacation. I was actually at that point teaching at another college for that moment, and it was spring vacation, and I wrote this
a tome.
This document.
I remember.
Yeah, I just pulled it out the file in preparation for us. I pulled it out the file the other day and reread it. It's very amusing. But but the case I made in there that was self-serving was, it was in the spirit of the women's movement, and there was and the mission for the center as they envisioned it, which involved research but public programs, and it was a four-pronged mandate, really, that it made all kinds of sense, since this was going to be rooted in the university, but it was also going to be about the world that you came from and knew, that they should consider having a split directorship. partnership, directorship, and that was in the spirit of the
interesting.
women's movement, co-directors and so forth. And
That's right.
and it was, as I say, it was self-serving, but in fact, it's really
It
what they ended up
sparked, yeah.
doing when they parceled out this small, ultimately small amount of money. But when I think back then to the first year or so, yes, the two of us and the two of them, and it really was, in a way, an example of what was happening in those days, and that is 4 people got together and came from very different backgrounds and experiences, but shared their belief in the project and their energies and their knowledge. And so we had to, I've often thought that it was a 4-person team that got this spinning and going, and then later, of course, it was lots of other people, staff people we developed and so on. I mean, one of the biggest points in those days, that even if we had money to hire staff, you couldn't go and put an ad in a paper and said, we want someone who knows something about women in politics, because no one knew anything.
Yeah.
There wasn't anybody like that. We had to grow our own expertise. So we all taught each other, the 4 of us, and we worked together. And then you and I, as you say, developed a program. So talk now about, because the very first program here that was of major significance and still is going in the form, it's gone through various forms, was the program for women state legislators, the Conference for Women State Legislators.
Well, the idea came up because of Ellen Rosenthal's expertise in state legislatures, and he met very frequently with them, and I think he'd had some conferences, particularly
And
with
could get
legislative
funding
leaders.
For that work, which gave us an opportunity.
It could get funding. And I may be not 100% accurate, but I don't believe there was a single woman legislator who came to any of those meetings, because they were all legislative leadership. And Alan didn't. His primary goal was not to seek out women. So, of course, we noticed that, and it lit a spark. So we thought, why not a conference of women state legislators? And people laughed. The first problem was nobody knew who they were or where they were, which is truly astonishing today, given the record of the center in, what should I say, data about women office holders at all levels. So the way I used my experience with the American Association of University Women, and we tapped the major women's organizations, established women's organizations of the time, which were the League, the AUW,
League of Women Voters,
League of
for the
Women
record.
Voters, the AUW, and an organization of business and professional women. And they all had branches and chapters around the country to tell us who the women legislators were in their states. And then we established various criteria, and we got their responses that the conference had to be bipartisan. We wanted participants who had experience, you can't say prestige, but who were very serious legislators. And we wanted different ages, all the criteria we use today for diversity, and we wanted geographic representation. But we wanted more than that. We didn't want just a conference, because this was a first, right? So we wanted to record it in some way, and we weren't thinking of television in those days. Actually, some of the women were concerned that if we had press at that conference, that they couldn't talk freely. So after discussing it, we decided what we needed was a publication, a legitimate, important publication that would withstand academic scrutiny. That was very important. Well, it was not an easy idea to sell to potential authors, because, to cite one example, the author who finally accepted our offer, Jean Kirkpatrick, mulled it over for a while. She was at the time, I think, a professor at GW.
She was in Washington, and she had finished
She
a
was a
major book
professor.
on Argentina, her dissertation on
Yes.
Argentina,
And her
not
husband
women.
was a big thing in
Her husband was
the
executive director of the
association.
American Political Science Association.
So she discussed this potential project of writing a book about the conference with a number of political scientists. And a political scientist whom I respected a great deal, a man, of course, very senior, said, you can't do that because there's not a subject there. There's not a subject there. Women
But
in
Jean, you
politics.
don't have a subject, he
Yeah.
said to her.
I think that challenged her because we've learned since she likes challenges. So together we drew up a plan which it would involve the participants of this conference filling out a long academic questionnaire, a survey of sorts, which would be the basis for subsequent interviews with every single legislative participant. Jean, in the letter of invitation to the eventual participants, this was explained and the questionnaire was sent to them. And several were reluctant to participate because there'd been no precedent for this kind of thing. But we had 50 outstanding people from 26 states, I believe, for 3 days in the Poconos. All the speakers we invited came. I believe they were all female, now that I think about it. They came from California to Maine, all over the country. And once they got to the Poconos, they could not stop talking. They were divided into discussion groups. We have all kinds of reports from there, and the superb book that Jean Kirkpatrick eventually wrote, Political Woman, which I'm happy to see is prominent space here in your bookshelf. But they loved the discussion groups, and they were less happy with the plenary sessions, I remember, because they all wanted to talk all the time and they didn't want to be talked at. But some of the plenary sessions were very significant and also first of its kind, with very distinguished speakers. So we worked them hard, and there are all kinds of conclusions from that conference about the reactions of the participants. But it's been the first of, I don't know how many conferences the center has done since.
The center went on.
Extraordinary.
Yeah. What was most interesting, not in a globally interesting way, but to me personally, is that somehow it took us 10 years for me to wake up and say, we started to develop relationships with that constituency, and we didn't do anything about it, partly because you left during that time, and the center had the pressures and the funding and so forth, but it took us 10 years, and then 10 years later we had the second conference for women legislators. That was on Cape Cod, and that was in '82 when the ERA went down, and that was another one for about 50 people, and that was one that actually that was the first one that was organized by a very young woman who had been here at Eagleton as a graduate student for a year, and then we brought back, and her name was Debbie Walsh, and she's now the director of the center and stayed at the center ever since then. But that Cape Cod conference was when 10 years later when the ERA went down, and it was after that conference that I began to talk about. I've always had grandiose notions without, the pocketbook to go along with them, but it was that we had to have every woman legislator in the country. And in fact, we managed to talk an important foundation official who was supporting us into helping us develop a program that we didn't have money to. In the first two conferences, we paid those women. That is, we paid the travel expenses. We got foundation grants, and we paid the travel expenses to come to those conferences. For the very first one to which we invited every woman legislator in the country, we had elaborate mechanisms and suggestions for how they could get funding to bring themselves to the conference, and then we paid for the program once they were there. And we went on to have a series of national conferences for women legislators that have all sorts of other stories attached to them that I won't go into now, but they were and have continued to be an extremely important part of the center. We haven't done a conference focused just on women legislators in recent years, but many more programs for elected women in various kinds of ways.
Oh, wonderful.
In fact, I mean, one observation to make in those days, women came together, Democrats and Republicans, and while they had different partisan affiliations and policy priorities, they shared a kind of passion about their status as women in politics and advancing their status and the challenges they faced in their parties. And they didn't all agree all the time, but it was possible to bring them together in ways that later in the 1990s became very much more difficult, and the partisanship got in the way of being able to mount the kinds of discussions that we had in the 70s and 80s into the early 90s, actually. So, but that's a whole other part of the story. I do want to say, though, about that first conference, for the record, it was funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, a foundation, and that was made possible because of what you said, because Eagleton had a history of work about legislatures that Alan Rosenthal was heading up, and because of that, it had credibility and access to foundations, and we could go in and make our case, and they took a chance on our work with women because of that. So being based here at the Institute of Politics was extremely important for the opportunities that we had and the connections that we had in foundations. The other foundation that was critical to the early part of the center was the Ford Foundation, and that's where the original $50,000 came from to establish the center, and then Ford funded some other work I won't mention right at this moment, but some other work that we did for years, actually, and some very important phases of the center's development in the period between the 70s into the late 80s, beginning of the 90s. But Carnegie funded it, but also for the record, I want to say that the book you mentioned, for which we commissioned Jean Kirkpatrick, and the center holds the copyright, and it's really the first book about women in politics in the United States, the first analysis, written by Jean, called Political Woman, making the title coming from responding to a book called Political Man that had identified in political science literature who political man was in the United States. And Jean's main point was that she discovered there was also political woman, and the description of who that was, based on our women state legislators and the interviews you described, is what the content of that book is about. It's very kind of old-fashioned in its political science approach, given what they're doing these days in political science. Very readable, very important early work about the subject. But what I want to say about it is that how is it that we got to publish a book by a major publisher, Basic Books? I remember you and I went to New York. I don't know how we got the introduction to him, but this venerable name in New York publishing, a man named Erwin Glickus, who was the head of Basic Books.
I think maybe it came from Jean. I don't remember how it came.
Maybe.
No?
I don't think so. I think we found her after he said he would, but he was willing to support a book written by her when we recruited her. Yeah.
He may also have known Eli Evans, who at the time was the
Carnegie
program officer at Carnegie Corporation. But I'd love to talk a minute about the conference itself.
Absolutely.
Because it was so interesting. You say we did not do a second conference for 10 years, but the women who came were passionate when they left that they wanted to get together again. Two things, many things, but two things stand out at this particular moment. One is they did not consider themselves feminist. I don't think there was a feminist among them.
Or politicians.
Or,
they didn't want to be called politicians.
They thought of themselves not in the first sense as women. I mean, this all came out in the discussion groups and so on, and is covered in the book. But as mothers, wives, grandparents, volunteers, churchgoers, whatever they were, politician or woman was not the first thing. But then secondly, they thought of themselves as state legislators. That was important to them. There were only, in the whole country, some 300 of them.
344.
344? That, which was like 4% of the 7,000 and some state legislatures. So it was very few. The second thing I remember about the conference and subsequent ones is few of them had ever been to a conference about politics and legislatures. They never went on junkets. Maybe with one or two exceptions, they were not part of the leadership. They were not part of the inner groups, so they never had an opportunity to participate in an event like this. And they found that meeting each other and talking together was so enriching and emboldening that they all resolved to go home and do a lot of things differently, both to encourage other women and to advance the status of women in their state legislatures. It was extraordinarily educational for them.
One very funny factoid that emerged from that conference, you'll probably remember this, that speaks to your point about how they discovered that they had so much to say. I don't know how they felt when they first got the invitations, but when they got there, as that we had budgeted at the time, this was before videoing and before audio and so forth, and we hired court stenographers to come into the sessions, the discussion groups, and transcribe and the discussions. And I don't remember if, was it also the court stenographers who were at the interviews? Because every single legislator was interviewed. Jean Kirkpatrick came in with a team of researchers, and they interviewed each one individually, and that was the material for the book. But the discussion groups, court stenographers, we had hired court stenographers. We had a line item in the budget, the conference budget for that, from the grant that we had. And then this company that was transcribing these court stenographers' tapes ended up billing us double what we had estimated, and they said they had never covered, they were unable to estimate accurately because they had never covered a conference where people talked so much, had so much to say. So it cost us a lot more, but we got a lot more.
Well, we had 4 discussion groups, I believe, that went morning and afternoon.
Yeah.
And each group had a rapporteur.
And a set of questions.
Yes.
It's very structured.
Very specific questions. And the rapporteurs were unable to report back to the plenary because so much had gone on in each discussion group, they didn't feel they could do it justice by reporting. So everybody waited for the transcript in Jean's book and a report we sent out afterwards explaining.
That you wrote.
Yeah.
A report from that conference. A very important early document.
Yeah, very interesting things came out of that conference. It was inspiring to all of us.
Do you remember there was one speaker, of all the speakers, this is the kind of stuff I remember, right? Probably goes to my being the person who came into all this reading fiction and so on, but and personal stories. But do you remember there was a woman who I've just recently saw her name on a program, Sheila Tobias, was an early feminist in academia, an administrator, I think at Wesleyan at the time, an outspoken feminist, and we invited her to speak. And do you remember what she said to the plenary session? No. She had not been in politics, but she knew about the ideas of the women's movement, and she was speaking to them about women's status and so forth in general. But she said to them that she could never run for office the way that, remember this is 1972, right, when we held the conference, never could run for office the way that they did. And the reason was that she had in her personal history slept with a number of people. This was the big revelation. It was shocking at the conference. And
I guess so.
She had indicated that she'd had an active single life, and this was going to make it impossible for her to, when we think about some of the stories we've heard about political people since then, male and female.
But the legislators themselves were very careful, and they said so, about their sex lives. They would barely, if ever, accept invitations to dine with fellow legislators, particularly in the evening. They would not go to bars or be seen drinking with fellow legislators, which in a funny way kept them out of the inner circle, because an awful lot of legislative business is done off the floor in those types of venues. But they were very careful about that. And if they had to commute to the Capitol, numbers of them took apartments together with another female legislator, if there was one, to avoid any possibility of gossip. They were very correct.
Very much the image of, in a sense, would you disagree with this ghettoized kind of experience within the legislatures? As you said, the male leaders were not inviting them to go to conferences and meetings, so they didn't really have an opportunity to move up in leadership in those early days.
That's right.
And was it in Jean's book, the early story that we told so often about a woman in the Maryland legislature named Pauline Menace, who had a feminist, there were a number of women in the Maryland legislature that had kind of a group consciousness about being women and they had a feminist sense of things, and they had approached the speaker at the time, I think, and asked for a woman to be appointed chair of a committee, and he had acquiesced by designating, I think it was Pauline, the chair of the ladies' restroom committee. This was his way of acknowledging their request for leadership.
Subsequent to which, the Maryland legislature formed a women's caucus, and also the Connecticut legislature under Audrey Beck formed a women's caucus, and they succeeded in pushing women to become committee chairs and so on.
Right.
Which they told the conference and encouraged other women to help elect additional women and to form women's caucuses and support each other.
Right, and
that
that
was
was, in terms of the history of the center, some of what we learned in those early days from that group of women that went forward with our work. We started to track, watch, monitor, convene, write about these women's legislative caucuses and focus on those organizations and ask questions about what role they were playing and what they were achieving. And so there's a history of that work, and not only women's legislative caucuses, but we held in later years meetings of elected women's groups and caucuses from other levels of government as well, because the issue of women organizing within the political world, enough women in there to actually get together, organize, and advocate, have an agenda, was something that we identified pretty early on.
I could talk about the conference for a long time, but we have a limited amount of time, so I just want to raise one issue, which is another program that you felt very strongly about, which was the program for visiting practical politicians.
The visiting program in practical
politics, because two of the first visitors, which meant they spent a semester or so on campus, were from our legislative conference. It was Audrey Beck from Connecticut and
Louise
a Democrat, and Louise Parent, a Republican from Delaware, was she?
Senator.
I think
Audrey
was a senator.
I think Audrey was in the Assembly in Connecticut, and Louise was a senator.
I think
in
you should say a few words about that program while we're having this conversation.
Well, I think one important thing to say about it in the history, in the center's history, because all the program areas, and they're still active today, but the vision, the concept originally, because we were responding to the design was to work in a number of different areas. The one that we never pursued was collecting and developing model legislation. I always remember the advisory committee had that in the original plan, and that was, we never went there. We never got there. But the other areas we did, and each one, and this has continued, and I think it's very characteristic of the center, and I also think it is what continues to make the center unique, is that it's operating as a research operation and education and information development, collection and dissemination and public programming, like conferences and so forth, convening. So each one of these feeds the other. And from the early days, so the first project was the Conference for Women Legislators. The second funded project was the visiting program in practical politics. And honestly, it was something I made up in the office that first summer when I, started to make up education programs and use the 5 books we were all using. And it came from, yours came from your background, right? The work on the conference. Mine came from my background, which was, I had had a fabulous course in graduate school in contemporary American novels in which every famous author of the day came in and sat with us in a seminar in class, and it made the experience of reading them and studying so much richer. And so in literature, and I was used to the concept of visiting poets on campus. So in literature, through literature courses, I had come to realize something that now is still a very big issue for me, which is everything at Eagleton is, we talk about, connects the study with the practice. Mm-hmm. The scholarship with the work in the world outside campus. And so this design for the visiting program in practical politics was, we create a course for students on college campus to study politics and women in politics. But the people who teach it are 2 practitioners. We bring in somebody who's really done it, seen it up close. The political science department, we got funding. We got a little bit of funding for that from, I think it was Chase. Again, a connection through the importance of our executive committee and our 2 co-chairs, Lucia and Shirley. We got a little bit of funding for that and recruited 2 women legislators, as you mentioned, Audrey Beck from Connecticut and Louise Connor from Delaware. But the political science department then had to grant credit for offering a course such as this one, balked, and were concerned about whether politicians could actually teach, and insisted that the way to do this was to have an academic, a professor of political science, run the course, grade the papers and so forth. And so we did that. And in fact, Eagleton still offers quite a number of courses that way, with actually now not so much because of the objections of the departments as because the burdens on practitioners, we want them to come into the classroom and do what they do best, and what they've not studied how to do is grade papers and develop research projects. So we like to use people for their strengths. In any case, Louise and Audrey came to teach this course, and the anchor was a woman they had identified a woman in the Department of Political Science who had never taught a course on women in politics before, but she worked to do the grading and do the exams and so forth. Louise and Audrey met each other through that program. They came and actually took turns living on campus. Mm-hmm. It was a true residence program. And it was our first foray, just as the Conference for Women Legislators was our first foray into that kind of work. This was our first foray into connecting learning in the classroom to what is happening for women in politics in the larger world, and connecting the students to some of those. And we've had many, many different kinds of versions of that work over the years since then. The first research program, besides Jean's book, was another kind of model, and that was we wanted a lot of people to work on something.
Data collecting.
The National Information Bank on Women in Public Office. And on 3x5 cards, we had people upstairs writing the names and addresses and titles of women in office at every level, and then we took them all over to a place called Scarecrow Press, and they printed them in, we did 2 different volumes, 2 different times, called Women in Public Office. WIPO was the acronym. And they were the first national directories of women in office, but also part of what was core, and I think you said it earlier, which was the concept of doing a census, so we knew who was out there, you know. People would say, well, what are you going to do after you finish counting? And one answer was, counting is fairly easy. There are so few women in positions of significant political power that it's not that hard to find them and count them.
But one of the results of that was press coverage. There were certain reporters who were sympathetic to the objectives of the conference, who reported on the conference. Very substantive, excellent articles in major newspapers. But thanks to this WIPO data bank that you developed, the center became a resource for the press from all over the country, because nobody else at the time had this kind of data, and we didn't have computers. So if they were covering politics, and women in politics was an issue of interest, became an issue of interest. I remember, was it the 72 or 74 election when so many women, more women were elected to office than previously. So you became a resource for the press, and that, of course, has grown over the years.
Much more. And now it's a media world that everybody's living in, right? And the center
Yeah.
is an incredible resource for the media, national, electronic media, the print media.
That started in those days.
It started, but it was a long, hard slog. And actually, the people who were writing in those days, remember Eileen Shanahan?
Of course, and Alan Otten of the Wall Street Journal,
That's
and
right.
Pat Rice of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And there were some others, but yeah.
Jerry Joseph.
Minneapolis Tribune.
Star and
Yep.
Tribune. We asked. She was on our advisory committee, but we asked her to write a column about the center so that there could be some knowledge about us. And she did. She wrote, I think, the first column before I think she was appointed ambassador.
That was before she was
appointed ambassador.
Yep.
But I think the story, the iconic story there was Eileen Shanahan's, because Eileen Shanahan was a wonderful reporter for the New York Times, and she reported on finance, and she got interested in this subject of women and women in politics, and they let her come to our conference and write about it, but it wasn't part of her assignment. It was what we call an overload, when you agree to teach an extra course and you don't get more pay for it. The women journalists in those days who cared about the women's movement in general and women in politics specifically in our area, they did it as an overload because the editors didn't see the story, that there was a story there, and were not assigning them to cover. And that went on for quite a long time. It was still, I think, a big issue in 1977 at the first National Women's Conference in Houston, one and only National Women's Conference, not our conference, but the National Women's Conference in Houston, funded by the federal government. It just took many years before there was legitimacy to studying the subject, writing about it if you were a journalist, thinking that it was a significant topic of inquiry if you were a researcher, all of it, yeah. I think that's right. And it was very hard, actually. By the way, the journalists in the early days, even when the interest was broader and they would call here for stories about women in politics, they really only wanted to talk about the fact there weren't very many women governors or congresswomen, the higher office. And we kept saying, because of the work on women legislators, but there are these women in legislatures. They're very interesting to watch. They're developing careers and so forth. But nobody cared about that.
That's one of the things that changed, because the one issue at the conference was the women felt, by and large, that they were there because they cared about issues, and they were there to represent the people. And this was different from their male colleagues, who were there because they were ambitious or they wanted to promote their business and would go on to higher things. At the time, this was not seen as a laudable goal by the women legislators. Today, that's changed a lot, because women today are obviously politically very ambitious, and ambitious in other fields as well. So we've seen a lot of progress.
It's true, although Debbie Walsh, the director of the center today, is fond of going around, and I think some of the other colleagues at the center are saying that women are there to do something, and men are there to be something or
Okay,
become
well, that's a
something.
better way of
Yeah, I
putting
mean,
it.
she still sees that as something to report on that's out there. What we haven't said is the women you brought to that conference. We talked about it a lot in the years after and with Jean's book. So they tended to be the mean age was 50 and beyond, right? And the male legislators at the time were about 20 years younger.
There was
These-
one 30-year-old and lots of grandmothers.
and lots of grandmothers, right? And they tended to be suburban women who were supported by their husbands' incomes. They weren't professional women. They had raised their children, and they had spent 20 years, we used to say, in the organizations you used for recruiting them, the League of
Professional
Women
volunteers,
Voters,
basically.
professional volunteers, civic volunteers. And then at the end of that, as we always described it, right, the reward for 20 years of civic volunteerism was being elected to
Elective
the
office.
legislature. But it wasn't a moment in their lives when they were beginning on a ladder that had a lot of opportunities and rungs for moving up in politics, because they were beginning at a much later point in life. And their male colleagues were beginning at a much earlier point and were, for the most part, lawyers, business people, connected to their careers and
Yeah, that's
advancing them.
changing.
So they were very different, these women.
They were
And most of them were married, had children, who by the time they went into office were grown.
I just point out there was no child care in those days, and the husbands were not about to take off from work to take care of children. So if these women had to go to the Capitol, their children had to be able to take care of themselves, which is why so many of them waited.
Yeah.
That's somewhat of a change.
Yeah.
That is not resolved yet, but it's
What,
improving.
from your vantage point, I mean, when you think about, well, just for the record, you should talk about why you left, why you stopped working here, because you were, the more obvious person to be a director for 25
Speaking of
years
children.
than I was. And I ended up staying and being the director and keeping
Because-
you involved in whatever ways I could. But
Well,
you left.
Thank you for doing that. Because my then 5-year-old daughter was in first grade. And this is in New York City. And she and a friend were supposed to be picked up by the friend's mother after school and driven to the friend's house. Instead, she was nowhere to be found. It seems she and her 5-year-old classmate walked home from the east side of New York through Central Park to the west side of New York, the block of Riverside Drive, on their own. And this was an era when New York was not quite as safe as it's regarded today. And I thought that was terrifying. I thought it meant that I needed to be closer to home. And that I and the children could not afford this commute, particularly since my husband was traveling a lot at the time. So that was the primary motivation, the only motivation for leaving the center, which I was very sorry to do. But when I joined Governor Kerry's administration, I will add as a footnote, I organized a conference in Albany for 10,000 women. So the work continued.
that's what I want you to do at the end of this conversation today, which is I want you to talk about, for the record, what you went on to do. So you did leave the center
I didn't
to
leave
be
women
based out
behind.
of New
Yeah.
York, right? You continued, first of all, we've continued to be in touch, and for many years while I was director of the center, in whatever way I could, I had you named to whatever committee or
Involved.
come to whatever
Thank you.
program or whatever.
Thank you,
Well,
yes. I
it
care
was
deeply.
it was for our benefit and the benefit of the center. It
It's
was
a wonderful thing.
and mine. But so I didn't want to let you go. But you did go on to an incredible career in New York while you were closer to the children as they were growing up. And I do want you to put that down for the record. So you went into, first of all, state government, right? So talk about that, and then the move you made to just, we have enough time for you to do that.
Well, this has nothing to do with the center.
But yeah, but you
I was
were
in the
one
women's
of the founding
division for
directors, right? One of-
Governor Kerry, a Democratic governor of New York during the fiscal crisis. We tried to get the ERA passed. that was in New York State Legislature. That was a big issue. We worked very hard on that. We organized this conference for 10,000 women, a very strongly feminist conference, more feminist than the center was at the time. At least it was articulated more. One of the things I did during that period was integrate the Longshoremen's Union in New York, which was 100% male, of course. And, I mean, obviously I was representing the governor. This was not F.S.Schmertz integrating it. But that was a huge step. And that was one of the reasons why subsequently I was hired by American Express, because the CEO there was so impressed that somebody could do this kind of work. And then at American Express, in my extracurricular time, I organized the women in American Express who had never been organized before as a group, from secretary through whatever, from mailroom through whatever level, to articulate their grievances within a corporate environment, which had never been done. So
For the record, put down, say your title at American Express. When you left American Express, you were?
Senior Vice President. I think the first woman Senior Vice President. And I entered knowing very little about business and corporate America,
yeah.
But that's another
Speaking
story.
to who you are, managing to do something like that.
Yes, yes. Well, and here
And
you are.
And also continuing to support the center through American Express, through the American Express
sure.
Foundation, which
course.
was very helpful to us over the years. And
It was one of the things that eventually reported to me, yes. Yeah, it's been a
And
great
then
ride. Anyway, I miss
been-
you in the center.
well, you know, you and I managed to make time to get together when we can. But I do want you to finish the record by saying about you, so then you retired early from American Express, but were appointed by President Clinton to
Be a director of the Romanian American Enterprise Fund,
out of which you,
which
this is what you're doing now.
brought the market economy to Romania in a lot of different ways, with completely Romanian staff whom we hired and trained and so on. And the Romanian American Enterprise Fund made enough money through investment in Romania that we have turned those funds into a foundation called the Romanian American Foundation, based in Bucharest, 100% Romanian staff, half Romanian board, half American board, and I basically developed the strategy and organized.
And was chair of the board until
I was chair of the board
last year, and are still on the board.
Right, and the Romanian American Foundation is sensational. It's got a fabulous track
Anybody
record.
can find it on Google if
You
they
can
look.
find it, definitely.
What is capitalized at the moment?
150 million.
It's the largest.
It's about to be 150.
largest entity
Oh, by far.
in Romania.
Nonprofit, absolutely, foundation, yes. It's a great leader of all kinds of wonderful activities that we do not have time to discuss right now.
So it does make me think if you'd stayed at the Center for American Women and Politics, we would be running the entire university, if not the entire state of New Jersey and beyond at this time.
Would have been
But
fun. But
it
the
was-
center has done fabulously under your leadership, no question about it.
It's doing very
So-
well under Debbie's.
And it's doing very
Anyway,
well.
I think we
You
have
have to
to
go.
end this
Yeah.
now, right? Because the time has come, but it's great. It's great to have you here, and who knows, we might have to tell more of the story in another
We don't
segment.
talk about old times very much. It's fun.
No, we don't. We have plenty to talk about what's going on today.
Right.
Right. It's great.
Thank you.